Well, I don't know if your mind operates the same way that mine does. Maybe you don't want your mind to operate the same way mine does. I think my mind works like the average person's mind thinks, but as we make our way through a New Testament letter like Paul's letter to the Galatians, I'm regularly looking back over the ground that we've covered, and I'm asking myself, am I tracking with what God's Word says here? Because as the Spirit of God is breathing out His truth through the writing quill of Paul's hand, we notice that whenever Paul writes, he's going somewhere with it. And we want to make sure that we are following what Paul is saying and not getting off course. Now, I think we've been following Paul pretty well since chapter 1, verse 6, up through chapter 2, verse 14, because throughout those passages, he uses primarily a narrative style of writing. Right? He's telling his story and his story with Peter and all these things in story format. So we've kept up a good pace up through chapter 2, verse 14. But we've been making our way through the passage we're currently on, and as we've been making our way through verses 15 through 21, you've probably noticed something. We've slowed way down. Why is that? Well, in our journey down the trail Paul has left for us, we've come to what you might call a forest. The trees have gotten a bit more dense, and we've needed to make our way carefully, watching the path in front of us with greater focus and occasionally glancing back to make sure that we're still on the right path. So as we look back, there are several things that Paul has marked out on our trail that we have been careful to observe, and we're going to review some of those things before we turn around and look on the path ahead of us. These are things that have to do with how a person is justified or made righteous in the sight of God. So first of all, as we've come to these trees, this forest, beginning in verse 15, we observe that doing the works of God's law, or doing what God's law requires, is not how a person is made righteous in God's sight. You are justified only by believing in God's Son. God declares you to be righteous and gives you a right standing in His sight only through faith in Jesus Christ. And we saw back in Galatians 1, verses 13 through 16, the Apostle Paul's summary of how he himself had been brought out of a life of faith in his own law-keeping and into a life of faith in God's Son, Jesus Christ. God had called Paul, and God had revealed His Son, Jesus, to Paul. But it was not on the basis of Paul's own works of doing what God's law required that God had done so. That wasn't the reason. God had called Paul and revealed His Son to Paul solely on the basis of God's own grace to Paul, because He wanted to. So doing the works of God's law does not justify or make someone righteous in God's sight. That's something that we've established, and Paul has been very careful to point that out to us. A second thing we've seen along the path that we have walked is putting one's faith in Jesus Christ for justification does not make a person a sinner against God's Old Testament law. That's something that we wrestled with a little bit last Sunday, because apparently that was the accusation that was being cast at Paul and Peter and other Jewish believers because of their fellowshipping with Gentiles who had professed faith in Jesus Christ. A number of Jews, including false believers and even some true Jewish believers, were apparently saying that because Paul is only holding up faith in Jesus Christ as the way for Gentiles to be righteous in the sight of God, that's a problem. Paul is not holding up obedience to God's law as part of the way Gentiles are made righteous in God's sight. Therefore, some are concluding, Paul is a sinner. Because Paul's not upholding God's law for Gentiles to observe. And even worse, if Paul does not compel these Gentile believers to keep the requirements of God's Old Testament law, according to Paul's opponents, Paul is pitting Jesus against God's law, making Jesus a servant of sin. That would be a bad thing, wouldn't it? But does Paul agree with their line of thinking? Is Paul a sinner for seeking to be justified by Christ? Is Paul a sinner for not including God's law as a part of the way to be justified in God's sight? Is Paul's opposition making Jesus out to be in agreement with Paul's sin? How does Paul respond to his opponent's accusations? Certainly not. Right? You see the very, very loaded way that he says, this is not at all the case. He says, certainly not. May it never be. God forbid. That's not even at all what's going on. That's not even close to a plausible interpretation of what Paul is doing. Paul is not a sinner to exclude law-keeping righteousness from his good news of justification. In fact, Paul would be a sinner if he included law-keeping righteousness as necessary for a person to be justified. That's what would make him a sinner. Faith in Jesus Christ had opened his eyes to see that his own righteousness from law-keeping was seen by God as filthy rags. With the eyes of faith, Paul saw that all of his personal attainments and his social standing and his religious zeal that he had apart from Christ was a big minus sign in the sight of God. So when by the undeserved grace of God, Paul came to see that a person is only made righteous in God's sight through faith in Jesus Christ, all those self-righteous, self-aggrandizing aspects of Paul's life that he previously considered to be gain, now he considered them all to be loss. And in his heart, Paul tore down his own self-righteous monument to the ground, so that there would not be one brick of self-confidence left. It would be sin for Paul, then, to start building back any confidence in his own law-keeping, or for him to compel anyone else to do the same in order to be seen as righteous in the sight of God. That would be wrong for him to do. There are things that we've observed on the path that are now behind us. What a person does is not how he's made righteous in the sight of God. He's made righteous in the sight of God through faith in God's Son, Jesus. We've also seen that putting one's faith in Jesus Christ for righteous standing before God does not make a person a sinner against God's Old Testament law. All right, so that's what's been behind us. Now, what's in front? Where are we going now? Well, it's time to look on the path ahead of us by starting in verse 19, where we left off last Sunday. There are several significant details in verse 19, which Paul is going to highlight for us now. He's going to expand a little bit in verse 20, and he's going to expand much more so later on in his letter to the Galatians. So what's the first detail this morning that Paul points out for us in verse 19? You come to chapter 2, verse 19, and you can summarize it this way. God's law brings death. Starts here in verse 19. For I, through the law, died to the law. Death comes through God's law. God's law is the means by which Paul's death comes. God's law produces death. But it's not because God's law is the problem. And you'll see this a little more explicitly here. Turn with me to Romans chapter 7, because Paul gives a really good summary of what's happening between God's law working in connection with Paul's life. Chapter 7, verse 9. I'll give you a moment to find that. The fact that God's law brings death is not the fault of God's law. The fault is something else. But in Romans chapter 7, verse 9, listen to what Paul says. He says, I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, that was its intended effect, I found to bring death. How did that happen? Verse 11, for sin, that thing that resided in Paul prior to Christ, sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it, right, through the law, it killed me. Now, did any of you grow up next to roads that used to not have speed limits? A couple of you? How fast did you find yourself driving on those kinds of roads? As fast as your wheels could go, right, Daniel? But then one day, maybe this was the case, maybe this isn't the case, but one day, possibly, in this scenario, driving very quickly down the road on which you've always driven quickly, you see a shiny new sign that's been set up beside the road, and written on that sign are the words, speed limit, 45 mph. What happens if you ignore that sign and keep driving as quickly as you always have? Well, this black SUV with flashing red and blue lights is suddenly going to appear behind you. It's going to pull you over, and you'll be issued a very expensive speeding ticket. Why? Because you've broken the law. Because you've exceeded the speed that authority has deemed to be safe. What was God's law designed to do? And there's a few different answers we can give to this biblically. But first of all, you're looking at Romans chapter 7. God's law was designed to bring life. God established divine boundaries within which his people would be safe. You stay inside these boundaries, you're going to be safe. But because we're born sinners by nature, is that what happens? Our sin deceives us into thinking that God's law is oppressive. God's law is unloving and unfair. God's hiding something from me. God doesn't want us to have any kind of fun in this life. And from the earliest age, from the moment we are mentally and physically able, we rebel against God's law. We trespass outside God's righteous, safe, life-giving boundaries. And God's law requires that rebellion against his law be punishable by death. Romans 7:12 again informs us and reinforces the fact that God's law itself is not the problem. Romans 7:12 says it's holy. The commandment is holy and just and good. It's our sin that takes advantage of God's law and brings death through God's law by rebelling against it. But there's another detail, turning back to Galatians 2, verse 19, that Paul wants us to observe. All right, so turn back there. Because first of all, yes, God's law brings death, but that's not the end of the story. Praise the Lord. You keep reading in verse 19, we see that God provided a way for sinners to die to the law. Notice what it says here. For I, through the law, right? The law was the means of death, but I, through the law, died to the law. In other words, God's law requires death for sinners, including Paul. And God is obligated by his own perfectly righteous character to condemn sinners to death for rebelling against his law. But God also has provided a way for a sinner's sentence of guilty to be dealt with that does not require the sinner himself to suffer the death penalty that he deserves. Did you catch that? God has provided a way for rebellious lawbreakers like you and me and Paul to escape the penalty that we deserve. What's that way of escape? Well, look at verse 20 of Galatians chapter 2. Paul goes on to say what that way of escape is. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. You realize that it is lawful for a holy, righteous God to provide a substitute in the place of sinners. He is allowed by his law to do that. You know, the Old Testament sacrificial system? That was a foreshadowing of what would happen here with Christ. A penalty must be paid for our breaking God's law. For God to ignore our sin and to not require some penalty would be unrighteous. It would be breaking his own law. But God did not necessarily have to require payment from us. God has the lawful right to exact payment from an acceptable substitute. Now, can we provide that substitute? Is there all kinds of animals that you and I can offer in exchange for our own sin? What does the scripture say? By the blood of bulls and goats, no one will get no one will get forgiveness. There is no remission of sin. Right? That's not sufficient. There needed to be a permanent solution. You and I can't provide that permanent solution to our sin. So for us to escape the penalty we are required to pay, God has provided for us a substitute that is acceptable to him. God has provided himself in the person of his divine Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus, the promised Messiah, God in flesh, came to earth, lived a sinless life as only God can, and he laid down his righteous life for unrighteous sinners by dying a bloody death on a Roman cross. And Jesus Christ became God's acceptable and lawful substitute for you and me. Now, you walk around the streets of America today, you ask people, do you believe Jesus died on the cross? You'll probably get a lot of yeses. The death of Jesus Christ is a historical and biblical fact that many people admit. Millions, perhaps billions of people believe that the death of Jesus Christ happened. And they would be correct to do so because it did. But believing that something happened will not permit God to ignore your sin against his righteous law. I mean, believing the fact that Jesus died on a cross 2,000 years ago is no different to God than believing that George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's not of any consequence to God. Friend, for the death of Jesus Christ to have any benefit for you, the payment that Jesus provided through his death on that cross has to actually be applied to you by God himself. You deserve the death penalty for your rebellion against God's law. God has provided Jesus to suffer the death penalty in the place of rebels like you and me. But for Jesus' bloody payment to be of any value to you, his payment has to be applied to your guilt. Which means that Christ's death somehow needs to be counted in the sight of a holy God as your death. That's the only way for you to escape the righteous demands of God's law. That's the only way to become dead to God's law. It's by the death of a perfectly righteous substitute being received by God in the place of your death. And that, Paul says, is what has happened to him. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. His death has become my death. His crucifixion has become my crucifixion. In what Christ did on that cross, I have become a participant. I have been united with Jesus in the death that he has died. Christ's payment has been applied to my guilt. The penalty that Christ paid has satisfied the righteous demands of God's law for my rebellion. I am dead to the law and its demands because Jesus' death has been applied to my account. Not everyone can say that. Now keep in mind, right, in the context of what's going on, Paul's been fighting against the Jewish claim that in order to be righteous in God's sight, yes, you need faith in Jesus Christ, but you also need to provide your own righteousness that comes through keeping God's law. You need both of them, Paul. That's not true, Paul says. A person is made righteous in God's sight only by faith in Jesus Christ. Nobody is made righteous by his own law-keeping. He said back in verse 16, for by the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified. Zero, zip, nothing. We're not made righteous by anything that we do. Thinking that we can be righteous in God's sight through something that we do is an error that many have embraced. And Paul says, no. It's by faith in Jesus Christ alone. But we also need to beware of the opposite extreme. Because some people might read the first part of verse 19 and think, dead to the law? That sounds great! So simply by putting my faith in Jesus Christ, I can do whatever I want. I don't have to worry about any kind of punishment from God because I'm dead to the law. It no longer applies to me. So if Jesus paid the penalty that the law requires for my sin, then I can just live the way that I want. And all I have to do is just put the sin I commit on Jesus' tab. Thanks, Jesus! Now I can sleep with my girlfriend, and it's okay. Jesus paid for it. I can get drunk on the weekend with my friends, and it's okay because Jesus paid for it. I can indulge in pornographic movies and websites. I can live a life of laziness. I can cuss and take God's name in vain. I can slander someone in person or on social media. I can let my emotions fly at people willy-nilly, and it's okay. Jesus paid for it. Friend, if you're here this morning and you think that that is how the faith in Jesus Christ works, then you don't have faith in Jesus Christ. Because when God provided the way for you to die to the law through faith in His Son, it was not to free you to live life for yourself. And here's a final detail that Paul has highlighted for us to observe on the pathway that he's left for us to follow this morning. God's purpose for providing a way for sinners to die to the law was so that they might live to him. That's how verse 19 concludes. For I, through the law, died to the law, that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ, Paul says. His death has become my death. His crucifixion has become my crucifixion. I've been united with Jesus in the death that he has died. But what, as you keep reading, what are the effects in the life of a person who has been united with Jesus in his death? He goes on to say, it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The I that used to be active and alive, the I that would have had no problem with sexual immorality or swearing or gossiping or lazily mooching off of others or holding a grudge or being envious or anything else that the people of the world do very easily, that I is no longer alive. If you've been crucified with Jesus, that me-focused, me-loving, me-righteous, me-centered person has been put to death the moment you believe in Jesus Christ. And who is the one now alive in your old place? It's Christ. The old Paul had no problem lifting up his own righteousness before God. The old Paul thought that to be right in the sight of God, he had to work really hard to keep God's law. And he even goes so far as to say that he was pretty good at keeping God's law. And the old Paul was putting all his stock in the quality of his own righteous law-keeping. And maybe you're here this morning and you're not the debauched, prodigal, sin-depraved person that everyone else in the world is. Maybe you're more like this old version of Paul. And you could say with him, I never slept around like my friends did growing up. I've always been faithful to my wife. I've always treated people with dignity and respect. I've never talked bad about someone to their face or behind their back. I've never been drunk. I've never done drugs. I've never used a swear word, quite frankly. In all respects, I'm a pretty good person. Friend, if you're banking on any of these kinds of things as reasons that God should consider you to be righteous, you've missed everything that Paul has been saying. Everything. Because that's how Paul used to think about himself. That is the way Paul used to view his own righteous keeping of God's law. But then God, in his grace, saved Paul from that kind of thinking. And God, in his grace, revealed to Paul his Son. And that only through faith in God's Son, Jesus Christ, would Paul be seen as righteous in God's sight. That's the only way. Paul put his faith in Jesus Christ, and that old Paul way of pointing to his own righteousness was crucified with Christ. It was nailed to the cross to die a hideous death. And the old Paul, with that old Paul way of thinking, of putting stock in his own righteousness, was crucified. And guess who became Paul's life after that? It was Christ. Christ became Paul's confidence. Christ became Paul's righteousness. So what does living to God look like for Paul as he lives out the rest of his human existence on this earth. Verse 20 concludes, "And the life which I now live in the flesh," right? Flesh and blood, physical body, blood, bone, muscle tissue. "The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Not living by faith in his identity as a Jew. Not living by faith in his circumcision. Not living by faith in his own hard-earned standing in society. Not living by faith in his own human decency or goodness or righteousness from keeping God's law. The life Paul now lives in his flesh and blood human body, he lives by faith in Jesus Christ, who laid down his life for Paul so that Paul might live in him. The same Jesus who by grace, not having to do with anything that Paul had done, through grace had set his love on Paul. Friends, that's how God gets the glory he rightly deserves for the salvation of sinners. That's how God puts into action his master plan of redemption. That is God's grace on full display that Paul's talking about here. Verse 21, he finishes up this chapter, "I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness comes through the law," as people might argue, know what the implications of that are? Christ's death was in vain. So if any of us insist that we contribute to our own righteous standing in God's sight, this is what you're saying. That Christ's death was pointless, was meaningless, was wasted. So let me ask you this morning, in conclusion. You're here this morning. Are you living in denial of God's grace by depending on your own righteousness? Because that's what you'd be doing. Do you still embrace Paul's old way of thinking that God will see your goodness and accept you on the basis of the upstanding life that you have led? What has Paul emphasized repeatedly about a person's own works? That is not the basis by which you are made right in God's sight. That is a way of thinking that needs to be torn down. You need to see your own righteousness the way that God does. That it is proud arrogance to think that you could gain a righteous standing in God's sight by your own effort. And you need to humble yourself and cry out to God in desperation for the righteousness that he alone can grant, and put your faith in Jesus Christ alone. That's what you need to do. Whether you see yourself as the worst of the worst, the best of the best, believing on Jesus Christ and dying with him is the only way to be found righteous in the sight of God. Because faith in Jesus Christ is the only way that God has provided. So have you been united with Jesus in his death by putting your faith in him? Has that taken place?